Many of you, I presume, have seen Breaking Bad. And that's a really good example of the incorporation, at least in part, or maybe the possession by the shadow from the Jungian perspective, right? Because you have this ordinary high school teacher who really thinks that he's and acts, and his family as well, you know, like your typical persona, roughly speaking. He's just a normal guy. But part of the reason that he's a normal guy is because he actually hasn't been put in abnormal circumstances, and then all of a sudden he is. And he has a genuine moral conundrum, right? He's going to die of lung cancer, and he has a son who's got a lot of health problems, and he's terrified that he's going to leave his wife and his child behind with nothing. And then, of course, as the story, and so he decides to do something that temporarily that he regards as what they would normally regard as reprehensible, and of course he just gets tangled up in that. But then as the story unfolds, you see that it's more complicated, because it's not that he was just innocent good guy and he decided to turn bad. He's also very resentful and angry, and it's partly because he's a bit of a pushover at the beginning, or maybe more than a bit of a pushover, and also that he didn't really fulfill his own potential, and that, you know, he had friends who walked down the entrepreneurial path, and maybe they weren't quite fair to him, but whatever, he ends up not very successful as a high school teacher. So he's really angry about that, and so there's more motivation for him opening up the door to the terrible elements of his personality than just the fact that he's got good motivations to do so, and that unfolds, you know. And so you see the warps and twists in his resentful character increasingly manifest themselves as he walks down this road to really total brutality. And it's quite good. There's a book called Ordinary Men that's a lot like that. I don't think I've mentioned that to you before, but Ordinary Men is a book about, it's the best book of its type. Maybe it's the only book of its type. It's possible, but it's plotted much like Breaking Bad in some sense. It's a story about these German policemen in early stages of World War II. And they were guys who were old enough to be raised in Germany really before the Hitlerian propaganda came out in full force. You know, if you were a teenager, say in the 1930s, you were going to be pulled right into the propaganda machine, and maybe you were part of the Hitler Youth, and like you were raised in that, you know. But if you were older, then you were raised before that, and you're not as amenable to propaganda once you're older than about, well, I would say about 22 or something like that. It's pretty young, actually. If you're going to make a soldier, you have to get a soldier young, because once people are in their early 20s, say, they already have their personality developed. Anyways, these policemen were sent into Poland after the Germans marched through, and you know, it was wartime, and there was this hypothesis in Germany that the Jews in particular were operating as a fifth column and undermining the German war effort, because of course the Germans blamed the Jews and a variety of other people for actually setting up the conditions that made the war necessary. And so when the police were sent into Poland, they were also required to make peace, roughly speaking. And so they started out by rounding up all the Jewish men between 18 and 65 and gathering them in stadiums and then shipping them off on the trains. But that isn't where they ended. They ended in a very, very dark place. I mean, these guys were going out in the field with naked pregnant women and shooting them in the back of the head by the end of their training. And what's really interesting about that is that their commander told them that they could go home at any time. So this is not one of those examples of people following orders. And the reason they didn't, roughly speaking, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons they didn't is because they didn't think it was comradely, so to speak, to leave the guys they were working with to do all the dirty work and run off. You know, and that's really an interesting fact, you know, because in different circumstances, you wouldn't think about that as reprehensible, right? You'd think, well, that's part of teamwork and under rough circumstances, and that's at least in part how they viewed it. And they were also made physically ill multiple times, physically and psychologically ill by the things that they had to do, but they kept doing them anyways. So it's one step at a time, and that's the thing, is that you end up in very bad places one step at a time, so you've got to watch those steps.